This is not a story about a man who went into the woods to find himself. It is a story about a man who was thrown away by the world he nearly died to protect. William Wynne stood on the sidewalk of the suburban street he once called home, clutching a single duffel bag. Behind him, the bank-ordered locks clicked into place. Beside him, Smoky, a K9 who had sniffed out IEDs in the valleys of Kandahar, let out a low, confused whine. At 50, William was a giant of man, muscular, scarred, and decorated. But in the eyes of his neighbors, he was just a liability. They looked through their windows, not with sympathy, but with a cold, piercing judgment. Go find a shelter when a voice spat from across the street. You're scaring the kids. The stigma of the broken soldier followed him like a shadow. He wasn't a hero anymore. He was a reminder of a reality they wanted to forget. As the first cold rain of November began to fall, William realized the battlefield had moved. It wasn't in some distant desert. It was right here, in the heartless silence of the people he used to call friends. He turned his back on the flickering streetlights, his moss-green eyes hardening into flint. If they wanted him gone, he would vanish, but he wouldn't just disappear. He would build a world where their judgment couldn't reach him. The walk into the canyon wasn't just a physical journey. It was an escape from a society that had turned poison. William remembered the last day in town, the day the kindness of strangers finally broke him. He had stopped at a local diner, Smoky waiting patiently by the door, only to be told his type wasn't welcome. The whispers about his PTSD, the stares at his scars, the way mothers clutched their children as he passed. He's a ticking time bomb, they said. They didn't see the man who spent his nights staring at the ceiling, because the silence was louder than the mortars. They only saw a threat, deep in the throat of Blackwood Canyon. William found his new world. It was a jagged limestone cliff overlooking a narrow, rushing stream. To anyone else, it was a death trap. To William, it was a blank canvas of stone. He started with a handheld pickaxe, the rhythmic clink, 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 echoing through the gorge. He wasn't just digging a hole, he was carving out his pride. Smoky stood on the rocks above, his black and tan fur a stark contrast to the gray stone, guarding the perimeter. For the first time in years, William didn't feel the weight of prying eyes. Here, the only judge was the gravity of the rocks and the cold of the water. If the world didn't want him, the earth would have to take him. The cold was the enemy William knew best. He had felt it in the mountains of the Hindu Kush, a chill that didn't just bite, it claimed. By the second week, the stream was his only friend and his greatest threat. He needed warmth, not just a fire that would burn out, but a system. He began to gather stones from the riverbed, massive, water-smooth granite. The plan was mad: dam the stream to create a reservoir, then use copper pipes he'd scavenged from a scrapyard to run water through his fire pit and into the cave floor. The engineering was military-grade, improvised from a lifetime of field repairs. Smoky helped, his powerful frame dragging smaller logs to the water's edge. The neighbors in town, if they thought of him at all, probably imagined him freezing to death. They didn't know the broken veteran was currently out engineering their modern heating systems. Every stone William placed in the freezing current was a defiance of the world that said he had no place left. As the dam rose, the water began to pool, reflecting the gray sky and William's own rugged, unyielding face. He wasn't just surviving, he was conquering the elements that were supposed to kill him. The cave was no longer just a hole in the limestone. It was becoming a masterpiece of tactical survival. William Wynne worked with a feverish intensity that only a man with nothing left to lose could possess. He began to widen the interior, carving out a sleeping loft high above the stone floor to keep the rising heat trapped. The neighbors in the valley below probably spent their evenings arguing over thermostat settings. But William was calculating the thermal mass of granite. He used a mixture with ash and river clay to create a primitive but effective mortar, sealing the cracks in the cave walls to keep out the damp mountain breath. Smoky moved through the developing rooms like a ghost, his paws silent on the heated stone, his K9 instincts fully adapted to the subterranean fortress. But the solitude was often broken by the ghosts of his past. Sometimes, while the pickaxe swung, William would see the faces of the people who had turned their backs on him. The bank manager, the local sheriff, the old friends who suddenly became very busy when he lost his home. He channeled that bitterness into the stone. Every strike was a thank you for the rejection that had forced him to become something more than a victim. He was become the ghost they feared, the man who didn't need their world to survive. Word eventually reached the town that the crazy vet hadn't frozen to death. A group of hikers had spotted the smoke from his fire and the strange, artificial-looking dam. Instead of admiration, the town felt a new kind of fear. Rumors spread like a virus. William was building a doomsday bunker. He was plotting revenge. He was unstable. They couldn't understand why a man would choose the cold stone over their pity. One afternoon, a drone, likely sent by a local news station or a curious teenager, buzzed outside his cave. Smoky snapped at the air, his aggressive expression mirrored in William's own moss-green eyes. William didn't hide. He stepped out onto the ledge, his muscular frame silhouetted against the limestone, and simply watched the machine. He was a man who had seen real surveillance, real threats, and this felt like a childish insult. He knew they were watching him from their comfortable living rooms, judging his cave while they sat in homes that could be taken away by a single bank signature. The stigma followed him even here, miles from the nearest paved road. They called him a wild man, a threat to the environment. They didn't see the way he carefully filtered his water, or the way he only took dead wood for his fire. They only saw what they feared most, a man who was truly dangerously free. The dam wasn't just for heat anymore, it was for power. William Wynne knew that to survive the long winter of the canyon, he needed more than just a fire. He needed light. He began the most technical phase of his exile, building a micro-hydroelectric generator. He used a salvaged alternator from an abandoned truck he'd found deep in the woods and a series of hand-carved wooden paddles. The engineering was a delicate dance between the force of the water and the precision of the machine. Smoky watched from the bank, his head tilted as the water began to turn the crude turbine. Every revolution was a heartbeat of electricity. William's moss-green eyes flared with a rare spark of triumph as he wired the system into a set of deep-cycle batteries hidden in the cave floor. When the first LED bulb flickered to life, illuminating the hand-carved stone walls and the muscular frame of the man who built it, the cave ceased to be a hideout. It became a home. While the townspeople below lived in homes they didn't own, powered by a grid they couldn't control, William had built his own world from the rock and the river. He was no longer a beggar at their table. He was the king of his own mountain, and his crown was made of copper and stone. Survival in the canyon wasn't just about electricity and stone. It was about the primal ache of hunger. William Wynne began to transform the narrow ledge outside his cave into a vertical garden. He built tiered planters from cedar logs. Filling them with rich river silt, he hauled up bucket by bucket. It was backbreaking work that turned his broad shoulders into a roadmap of strained muscle and grit. But as the first sprouts of winter kale and hardy root vegetables broke the surface, a different kind of pain emerged. He remembered the town's harvest festival, a time when he was once the guest of honor, a local hero. Now, he was the ghost who scavenged. One morning, he found his perimeter wire tripped, not by a predator, but by a group of local hunters who had lost their way. They looked at his thriving garden with a mix of envy and disgust. Stealing the valley's nutrients when, one mocked, pointing a rifle at the soil. William didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stood there, Smoky at his side, a 30-kilogram shadow of coiled fury. The sheer presence of the veteran, his moss-green eyes as cold as the limestone, was enough to make them retreat. They left, but the sting of their words lingered. To the town, even his self-sufficiency was an act of theft. They wanted him to be the broken man on the sidewalk, not the architect of a mountain Eden. The air in the canyon changed. It wasn't just cold, it was lethal. The sky turned the color of bruised steel, and the stream began to choke on its own ice. William Wynne knew the big freeze was coming, the kind of winter that kills the unprepared in their sleep. He spent 18 hours a day prepping. He reinforced the cave entrance with a double-layered heavy canvas and would frame to create an airlock. He hauled cords of oak and pine, stacking them so tightly they became a secondary wall against the wind. But the mental toll was rising. In the silence, the stigma of his rejection felt heavier than the snow. He found himself talking to Smoky more often, the dog's intuitive grunts his only counsel. He thought of the town below, with their salt trucks and heated sidewalks. They would be fine. They had each other. He only had the stone. But then, a discovery changed everything. While scouting the upper ridge for firewood, William found a buried drainage pipe from the town's old industrial sector. It was leaking a strange, dark fluid into his stream. The very people who called him a threat to the environment were poisoning the water he spent weeks taming. His moss-green eyes didn't just harden. They ignited with a soldier's righteous fury. William Wynne wasn't a man of words. He was a man of action. He didn't go to the town council to complain. He knew they'd only laugh and call him a trespasser again. Instead, he used his knowledge of fluid dynamics and military engineering. If they were going to use his canyon as a sewer, he was going to show them exactly where that sewer led. He spent 3 days in the freezing sludge, diverting the toxic runoff away from his dam and into a natural limestone sinkhole he'd discovered. This sinkhole, however, sat directly above the town's main groundwater aquifer. It was a tactical chess move. If they poisoned his home, they poisoned their own. Smoky stayed by his side through the freezing rain, his thick fur a shield against the wet. During the work, William found a discarded child's toy near the pipe, a plastic soldier. He held it in his mud-stained hand for a long time, a bitter irony that didn't escape him. They raised their children to play with men like him, while they treated the real ones like trash. As he sealed the diversion, William felt a cold sense of justice. He wasn't the monster they made him out to be. He was simply the mirror they didn't want to look into. The mercury didn't just drop, it vanished. By mid-January, the canyon had become a cathedral of ice, a place where even the wind seemed to freeze mid-scream. William Wynne's cave was the only pocket of warmth in 100 square miles of white death. The geothermal floor, powered by the dam stream, hummed with a steady, life-saving heat. But as the physical world stabilized, the psychological walls began to close in. The isolation was no longer a choice. It was a siege. William found himself staring at the stone walls, the faces of the people who had spat on him appearing in the flickering shadows of the fire. "Why do you stay?" the shadows seemed to whisper. He looked at Smoky, whose breath came in rhythmic, silver plumes. The dog was the only thing keeping him tethered to his humanity. In the town below, the first signs of the silent counterattack began to show. Reports of foul-smelling water and strange illnesses started to clog the local news. They were tasting the poison they had tried to bury in his backyard. William listened to the reports on his hand-cranked radio, his moss-green eyes devoid of pity. He wasn't a monster, but he was a man who had been taught that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The madman in the cave was now the only one with clean water, and the irony was as cold as the ice on his ledge. The town's arrogance finally shattered under the weight of the toxic plume. The local reservoir was officially declared a biohazard, and the experts were baffled by the sudden appearance of industrial waste in the deep aquifer. Panic, a cold and selfish thing, gripped the valley. People who had once laughed at William Wynne's cave life were now fighting over bottled water in the aisles of the local grocery store. But then the storm of the century hit. A bomb cyclone that dumped 5 feet of snow in 12 hours, cutting off the main roads and leaving the town isolated and thirsty. In the dark, the town's hatred turned into a desperate search for a scapegoat. A mob of local men, led by the same hunters who had mocked William's garden, decided that the vet on the mountain was responsible. They didn't have proof, but they had anger, and they had snowmobiles. William watched the flickering lights of their approach from his ledge. He didn't feel fear. He felt a familiar, cold clarity. He was no longer a homeless veteran. He was a commander defending his perimeter. He whistled low to Smoky, the dog's hackles rising as he sensed the intrusion. The world was coming for him one last time, and this time there would be no police to call. "We know what you did, Wynne," the lead hunter screamed, his voice cracking in the sub-zero air. "You poisoned the water. You're coming down, or we're coming up." William Wynne didn't move. He stood at the edge of the ledge, the red flare in his hand casting a bloody light over his salt and pepper beard. "I didn't poison your water." William's voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to carry more weight than their threats. "Your own greed did that. I just showed you where you were dumping it." The mob hesitated. They saw not a broken man, but a mountain phantom, a ghost of the war they had tried to forget. Smoky stood at William's heel, his eyes glowing like amber coals. Suddenly, the earth beneath the mob groaned. The bomb cyclone had triggered a massive shift in the snowpack on the ridge above. A wall of white death was beginning to move. In that instant, the hatred vanished, replaced by primal terror. The mob turned to run, but their snowmobiles were stuck in the deep drifts. William watched the avalanche begin crown. He had every reason to stay in his warm cave and let the mountain do what the town couldn't. But as he saw the terror in her eyes, he remembered the vow he had taken 30 years ago. He wasn't a vigilante. He was a soldier. And soldiers don't leave men behind, even the ones who hate them. The silence that followed the avalanche was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Under the limestone overhang, William Wynne clawed his way through the freezing white powder, his lungs burning with the intake of ice-cold air. Beside him, Smoky emerged like a dark phantom, shaking the snow from his black and tan coat, his amber eyes immediately scanning for the scent of survivors. The mob that had come for blood was now buried in the very mountain they sought to conquer. William didn't hesitate. He moved with the mechanical efficiency of a battlefield medic. He found the lead hunter, the man who had just been screaming for his head. Pinned beneath a snowmobile, his face a mask of purple bruised terror, with a grunt that echoed through the canyon. William braced his broad shoulders against the metal frame. Muscles rippled under his salt and pepper hair as he heaved the machine upward, defying the weight of the steel and the stone. Smoky began digging frantically nearby, his powerful paws unearthing another man gasping for breath. There was no mockery now, no talk of crazy vets or ticking time bombs. In the shadow of the cliff, there was only the raw, primal gratitude of men who had seen the abyss and been pulled back by the very hand they had tried to bite. The cave, once a solitary fortress of spite, was now a makeshift field hospital. For men, the same ones who had come to burn him out, now lay on William Wynne's heated stone floor, wrapped in his wool blankets. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, wet wool, and the low, rhythmic hum of the hydroelectric generator. William moved among them with a silent, terrifying grace. He offered them cups of hot pine needle tea, his moss-green eyes never lingering long enough to hear the apologies that were stuck in their throats. "Don't talk," William muttered, his voice like grinding gravel. "Save your breath for the walk back when the storm breaks." Smoky sat by the entrance, a 30-kilogram sentinel of black and tan fur, his amber eyes never leaving the strangers. The irony was a physical weight in the room. Outside, the town was paralyzed, thirsty, and dying of its own poison. Inside this hole in the ground, there was heat, there was light, and there was water, so pure it tasted like the mountain soul. One by one, the men looked around at the engineering marvels William had carved from the rock. They saw the tiered garden, the copper pipes, the pulsing batteries. They realized then that William hadn't been hiding from the world. He had been building a better one. By morning, the blizzard had settled into a frigid, crystalline haze. The men William had rescued were stable, but they were not the only ones in trouble. The radio crackled with desperate emergency broadcasts from the town below. The main water main had burst under the freezing pressure, and the backup wells were failing because of the toxic plume William had diverted. The town was facing a humanitarian crisis of their own making. "You have to help them, Wynne," the lead hunter croaked, his voice raw from the cold. "There are kids down there. My kids." William Wynne looked at the man, his moss-green eyes unreadable. He thought about the mothers who had pulled their children away from him in the park. He thought about the police who had used their flashlights like weapons to drive him into the woods. He looked at Smoky, who let out a low, questioning whine. William didn't answer. He simply began to pack a heavy tactical rucksack with gallon jugs of his purified mountain water. He wasn't doing it for the town council or the bank. He was doing it because a soldier's duty doesn't end when the uniform comes off. He was going to walk back into the mouth of the lion that had tried to eat him, but this time he was bringing the only thing that could save it. The town was a frozen graveyard of pride. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of William Wynne's tactical boots and the steady panting of Smoky. No one was outside. They were huddled behind locked doors, shivering in the dark, waiting for a government that couldn't reach them through the 5-foot drifts. William approached the first house, the one where a woman had once pulled her daughter away from him. He didn't knock. He simply left 2 gallons of crystal-clear mountain water on the porch, along with a small bundle of firewood he'd carried. Smoky stood guard at the base of the steps, his ears perked, a 30-kilogram shadow in the whiteout. As William moved to the next house, he saw a face in the window, pale, hollow-eyed, and terrified. When the man inside realized who was standing on his porch, he didn't call the police. He wept. The madman they had hunted into the rocks was now the only thing standing between them and a slow, thirsty death. William didn't stop for thanks. He didn't want their gratitude. He wanted them to understand that the man they had discarded was the only one who hadn't discarded them. He moved through the streets like a ghost of the war they'd tried to forget, leaving a trail of life in his wake. The water William left didn't just hydrate the town. It ignited a fire of realization. By the next morning, as the sun broke through the leaden clouds, the people of the valley emerged from their frozen homes. They gathered in the streets, looking at the clear jugs and the bundles of wood. They knew where they came from. They knew the madman they had shua Dewey was the only reason they were still breathing. But pride is a stubborn thing. A small group, led by the local sheriff, the same man who had served the foreclosure notice, attempted to organize a recovery team to find William's cave. They claimed it was to thank him, but their eyes still held the glint of suspicion. They couldn't accept that a man they treated like dirt was their superior in every way. William watched them through his binoculars from a ridge above. He saw the sheriff's truck get stuck in the first mile. He saw them struggle with the simple reality of the mountain. He realized that they still didn't get it. Survival isn't about teams or authority. It's about the soul. He whistled to Smoky, the dog's black and tan fur blending into the rock. "Let them search," William muttered. "The mountain only shows its secrets to those who have lost everything." While the town was busy trying to find William, the poison he had diverted was doing its work on their conscience. The sheriff's recovery team eventually made it to the drainage pipe William had exposed. They saw the dark, toxic fluid oozing into the sinkhole. They saw the agency stamps on the rusted metal. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The environmental disaster wasn't William's fault. It was a result of a secret deal the town council had made with a local industrial firm to dump waste safely into the mountain. William Wynne hadn't poisoned them. He had simply unmasked their own betrayal. He watched them from the shadows as they stood around the pipe, their heads bowed in a mix of shame and horror. They had spent months hunting a hero and protecting the monsters. William felt no joy in their dawning horror. He only felt a cold, hard clarity. He whistled for Smoky, the dog emerging from the mist like a vengeful spirit. It was time for the final move. He wasn't going to hide anymore. He was going to bring the truth to their doorstep, whether they were ready for it or not. William Wynne didn't arrive in town with a plea. He arrived with a judgment. As the morning fog clung to the frozen eaves of the town hall, the heavy thud of his boots echoed through the empty square. Beside him, Smoky was a silent shadow of black and tan, his K9 harness gleaming with frost, his eyes locked on entrance. The townspeople, already rattled by the toxic water and the sheriff's grim discovery at the ridge, began to emerge from their homes. They saw the man they had mocked, the cave dweller, standing before the seat of their local government. William didn't look like a beggar. He looked like a conqueror. He carried a water-damaged logbook and a series of high-resolution photos he'd taken of the industrial pipe. When the mayor stepped out, his face pale and eyes darting with fear, William didn't speak a word of anger. He simply dropped the iron bolt and the photos onto the ice at the mayor's feet. The clatter of metal on frozen stone was the only sound in the square. "The mountain doesn't keep secrets." William's voice was a low, terrifying rumble. "It only returns what you try to hide." The crowd, once a mob of mockers, was now a sea of downcast eyes. They realized the veteran hadn't been hiding from them. He had been holding the mirror they were too afraid to look into. The truth had been served, but the mountain wasn't finished with its retribution. A sudden, unseasonable warm front collided with the bomb cyclone remnants, triggering a catastrophic snowmelt. Above the town, the Blackwood Canyon was no longer a frozen sanctuary. It was a funnel for millions of tons of churning, icy water. William Wynne heard it first, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the very floor of his cave. It was the sound of the upper ridges collapsing into the stream. His dam, the masterpiece he had built to survive, was now the only thing standing between the town and a flash flood that would wash away their homes and their sins. From his ledge, he could see the water levels rising with terrifying speed, logs and boulders smashing against his granite barrier. He had a choice. He could let the dam break and watch the town be purged by the river. Or he could use his engineering to divert the surge into the old limestone quarries, saving the community that spat on him. He looked at Smoky, whose amber eyes reflected the chaotic white water. "They don't deserve it, Smoky," William whispered. but the kids do. He reached for his heavy iron pry bar. The madman was about to become the only thing holding back the apocalypse. Every ton of water diverted was a ton that wouldn't crash into the town's elementary school or the local clinic. William Wynne worked like a man possessed, his muscles screaming against the freezing spray and the sheer weight of the stone. He was dismantling his own life's work, the dam that provided his heat, his light, and his dignity, to save the people who had called for his arrest. Smoky was a blur of black and tan, dragging small debris away from the intake to keep the diversion channel clear. The dam began to groan under the unnatural stress. A final, massive boulder, dislodged from the ridge above, was hurtling toward the structure. If it hit the main span, the diversion would fail. William knew what he had to do. He jammed his iron bar into the last remaining support, intending to collapse the sidewall early to release the pressure. It was a suicide mission for his home. As the sidewall gave way, the water roared into the quarry with a sound like 1,000 freight trains. The main surge was redirected, but the backlash of water and stone swept William off his feet. He disappeared into the churning white foam, Smoky's desperate bark echoing through the canyon as the madman was swallowed by the river he had tamed. The roar of the diversion slowly faded into a hollow, haunting echo. Down in the valley, the townspeople stood on their porches, dry and safe, staring up at the canyon with a dawning, horrific realization. The flood that should have erased them never came. The water had been tamed, but the man who tamed it was gone. It was the sheriff who first found the strength to move. He didn't call for a recovery team this time. He grabbed a coil of rope and a medical kit. His face ashen with a debt he knew he could never repay. They found Smoky first. The K9 was 2 miles downstream, his powerful 30 kilograms frame battered and shivering, his black and tan coat matted with ice. He wasn't barking. He was whimpering, his amber eyes fixed on a tangle of uprooted pines and jagged limestone at the river's edge. Beneath the debris, partially submerged in the killing chill of the water, lay William Wynne. His muscular frame was motionless, his moss-green eyes closed, his face a mask of blue-tinged exhaustion. He had broken the mountain's fury with his own body. As the townspeople gathered at the bank, looking at the man they had once treated as a plague, the silence was broken only by the sound of Smoky licking William's frozen hand, a desperate plea for the ghost to return. William Wynne didn't wake up in his cave. He woke up in the local clinic, the very building he had saved from a flood. The room was warm, far warmer than the stone floors of Blackwood Canyon. But the air felt heavy with a different kind of pressure. Outside the glass door, a crowd had gathered, not with pitchforks or cameras, but with a crushing, silent guilt. The mayor, the sheriff, and the mothers from the park were all there, staring at the man who had traded his sanctuary for their lives. William's moss-green eyes scanned the room, landing on Smoky, who was sleeping at the foot of his bed, his black and tan fur clean and dry. Every breath hurt. The river had broken 2 of his ribs and filled his lungs with the mountain's chill. When the sheriff finally entered, he didn't bring a warrant. He brought William's military medals, which they had recovered from the half-destroyed cave. "We were wrong, William," the sheriff said, his voice cracking. "About everything. The water, the stigma, all of it." William didn't answer. He didn't want their apologies. He looked at the medals, then at his scarred hands. He wasn't a hero in the parade. He was a man who had been pushed to the edge and found that he still knew how to hold the line. The town's apology didn't end with a hospital bed. While William Wynne recovered, a strange thing happened in Blackwood Canyon. The very people who had once called for the madman's removal were now hauling stone, timber, and copper pipes up the cliffside. They weren't just fixing the dam, they were expanding it. They were rebuilding the cave, reinforcing the entrance with steel and glass, and clearing the toxic drainage pipes once and for all. When William was finally discharged, he didn't find a cold, empty hole in the rock. He found a sanctuary. The town had pooled their resources to install a high-end solar array and a professional-grade water filtration system. They hadn't done it out of charity. They had done it as a down payment on their own souls. As William stood at the mouth of his new home, Smoky by his side, he saw the sheriff waiting for him. "The mountain belongs to you, William," the sheriff said. "But we'd be honored if you let us keep the stream clean from now on." William looked at the thriving garden, the humming generator, and the faces of the men who had once hunted him. He realized that the stigma hadn't just been his burden, it had been theirs. And in saving them, he had finally allowed them to save themselves. The valley was no longer the same place William Wynne had returned to. The frost was still on the ground, but the icy silence of discrimination had begun to melt. The madman's cave was now a beacon of resilient engineering, a living laboratory that the town's high school had started using for field trips. William stood at the entrance, his broad shoulders tensed under a heavy tactical flannel, watching a group of teenagers sketch his hydroelectric system. Smoky sat by his side, his aggressive yet loyal amber eyes tracking their every movement. His K9 harness now gleaming with a silver Wynne Rebellion stencil. These were the same kids whose mothers had clutched them in fear just months ago. William felt the weight of his 50 years in every joint, but his moss-green eyes held a rare spark of contentment as he watched them learn from the rock. They were building something here, something stronger than concrete or steel. They were building a community that understood that survival isn't about teams or authority. It's about the soul of the land. He looked at the mayor, who was awkwardly trying to help clear debris from the new garden tiers. The man's hands were soft and used to the work, but his deep forehead wrinkles showed a genuine sense of purpose. William didn't smile, but a nod of tactical respect passed between them. The old soldier had finally found a cause worth fighting for right here, in the heart of the world that had tried to forget him. The town had accepted him, but the world wasn't done with its judgment. The news of a self-sufficient, high-tech cave system powered by clean energy and guarded by a legendary K9 operative began to spread on the dark web. It wasn't just a crazy vet story anymore. It was a blueprint for dissent. Government contractors, eager to reclaim the industrial pipe William had exposed, began to circle. They didn't come with apologies. They came with legal documents and silent drones. One afternoon, a heavy-lift black helicopter landed on the ridge above the cave. William Wynne checked the seal on his new tactical vest. The silver Wynne Rebellion stencil gleaming in the sunlight. He knew this moment would come. The world doesn't allow true freedom to exist in its own backyard. Smoky was ready, his aggressive and loyal amber eyes fixed on the retreating form of the chopper. The soldiers who emerged weren't here to rescue anyone. They were here to seize. William whistled a complex, non-vocal K9 code, activating the automated defenses he'd quietly installed months ago. The architect of solitude was about to become the strategist of insurrection. His moss-green eyes didn't show fear. They showed a calculated, tactical resolve. February was over, but a different kind of winter was approaching, one that would be solved with soup and blankets. The heavy-lift chopper didn't leave. It was just the vanguard. Within an hour, Blackwood Canyon was under a full tactical quarantine. A Black Ops recovery team, working for a shadow subsidiary of the global energy monopoly, was moving with surgical precision. They fanned out along the ridges, their high-end tactical gear absorbing the winter sun. William Wynne watched them through his reinforced bunker monitors, the 8K feed showing every twitch of their muscle. Beside him, Smoky was a shadow of aggressive intent, his K9 harness humming with the feedback of the automated defenses. William didn't fire. He initiated protocol blackout. The hydroelectric system was reversed, drawing all the water from the reservoir and flash freezing the canyon floor with a high-pressure mist of geothermal brine. The mercenaries' boots couldn't find purchase on the treacherous, razor-sharp ice. As they slid and stumbled, William activated the acoustic deterrent system he'd hidden in the limestone, a high-frequency pulse, calculated to shatter prying eardrums, tore through the gorge. From his console, William used a scavenged drone to drop not bombs, but small packages of his pure, mineral-rich legacy seeds into the new crevices. They thought he was defending a hideout. He was busy planning a global insurgency of self-sufficiency. Protocol Blackout had won them time, but the Black Ops team was relentless. They were now using chemical agents intended to collapse the limestone cave itself. William Wynne knew his engineering could only hold so much pressure. In the silence of the siege, he made a decision that would define his legacy. He sent an encrypted, time-delayed distress signal to a private security firm, not a government agency, but a mercenary guild he had crossed paths with in Syria. These were men who only understood profit. But William had a form of currency they valued more than oil. The signal contained the full, decrypted geological map of the agency's hidden toxic waste sinkhole network. It was the master key to a multi-billion-dollar environmental lawsuit. As the mercenaries from the guild arrived in unmarked white vehicles, clashing with the special ops team in a three-way battle for the ridge, William Wynne and Smoky prepared their final escape. He wasn't running from the fight. He was leaving them with a bomb that would destroy the energy monopoly from the inside. He picked up his rucksack, heavy with the original legacy seeds and the data RAC roots that could set the world free. They wanted a wild man, he whispered. We're going to show them what a wild man can build when he has a mission. They emerged from the ground not as fugitives, but as architects of a different kind of power. William Wynne and Smoky had navigated the limestone labyrinth, crossing an impossible chasm that even tactical drones couldn't chart. The blizzard was over, leaving a world sculpted in silent, blinding white marble. The new storm William had felt coming wasn't a battle of bullets. It was a battle for the very soul of resource. He took off his tactical NVG array, feeling the bite of the crisp alpine air on his face. His moss-green eyes scanned the horizon, noting the hidden, unpolluted geothermal vents he'd quietly mapped during his exile. These weren't places to hide. They were places to plant. He reached into his rucksack, pulling out a handful of his legacy seeds, ancient, resilient varieties he'd curated during his tours in the Middle East and Central Asia. In a natural, sun-facing cleft in the rock, heated by the Earth's own heartbeat, he used his tactical shovel to bury the first seed. Smoky sat on a high boulder, a 30-kilogram sentinel of aggressive intent, watching the empty sky for drones. William wasn't building a bunker anymore. He was planting a future. As the sun hit his salt and pepper buzz cut, he realized he wasn't just a veteran who survived. He was a founder who had finally found his front line. The new garden basin wasn't a bunker. It was a promise, as the days bled into weeks. The structure William Wynne built became less about survival and more about a standard of life that the world had lost. He utilized the geothermal hot springs not just to heat the air, but to create a gravity-fed hydroponic network using volcanic rock and salvage pipes. The legacy seeds responded to the perfect conditions with a vertical ascent, transforming the limestone cleft into a tiered cathedral of vibrant greens, deep purples, and rich earth tones. William's moss-green eyes watched over it all, not as a warden, but as an architect of a forgotten future. Beside him, Smoky paced the upper tiers, his 30 kilograms frame a constant, athletic reminder that their peace was bought with soldiers' vigilance. In the world below, the data dump William had left was dismantling an empire. Corporate stocks were crashing, environmental audits were turning into criminal trials, and the people of the suburb were finally looking up at the mountains, not with judgment, but with a new, fearful hope. William looked at his own scarred hands, now calloused not by a pickaxe or a rifle, but by the soil. He realized that in Dewey him, the world had allowed him to build the only thing that could truly save it. The stigma of the madman had become the blueprint of the founder.